Tonight's Meet the Artist and Public Talk actually closes out the season with Sarah, and it also starts another program that will begin on Saturday with something that's happening in between that Sarah's doing with the Central Middle School students, and that's our artist-led workshop. So we had an opportunity to bring Sarah here because of the program that is sponsored by the Ephraimson Family Fund, so we of course want to recognize them, and the Visitor Center for being our host this evening, so that's good stuff. I met Sarah in 2018, seems so long ago, here in Columbus when she was speaking at the Indiana Landmarks Conference, and one of the reasons why I thought about bringing her back, she inspired something in that talk that was a new way of thinking about preservation that was coming from a very fresh perspective, and had her, in that talk, she also touched on a few things that were educational for youth and some other lifelong learning stuff. So we thought this is a great time to bring you back, so glad to be able to do that. And then just a few things on Sarah and her background. Her work focuses on historic preservation, storytelling, and connecting people to the past. In 2018, Sarah was recognized by the National Trust for Historic Preservation as the recipient of the American Express Aspire Award. During the 2018 National Preservation Awards, that was her award, and then she also was an honoree of the inaugural 40 Under 40 People Saving Places list. So, good stuff. And a couple other reminders, if you would like to participate in Saturday's artist-led workshop, we have a few spots left. They're filling up quickly. This is a special workshop for Columbus. It's the tiny IMPay figure that you see here. Sarah is responsible for the Tiny Activist Project, which is Jane Jacobs. I'm sure she's going to talk about these things. And then we also want to remind you that 411, one of our new projects that the Arts Council has been managing, is open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and the exhibit this fall is also connected back to the 50th anniversary of the library, and some of our artists are in the audience now, and curators respectfully submitted. That is put together by Tricia Gilson and graphic designer Brooke Hawkins, and that talks about Cleo Rogers, as well as the Learning Patterns exhibit that is designed and produced by Law Office, and Lulu Laquitas is here, and we want to recognize Daniel Martinez, her partner, and you'll also see a mural by Law Office on the 411 building, and the recent launch of the community studio. So lots to check out at 411. And then one last final reminder, if you would like to participate in our second 50/50 community exhibit, see Susanna over here, Villegas, who is taking reservations for that community project, and she can explain more about what that means. Okay, thank you. Welcome.
So yeah, you can't hold me living in Ohio against me.
You just got lost.
I got stuck, more like it. We'll just go into my journey a bit. So I started out after high school pursuing a Parks and Rec degree, because parks are my one true love. I like hiking, I like camping, I like being away from people. But I quickly realized I wouldn't like to stay in Parks and Rec, because then I'd be dealing with people complaining about their blisters and whatnot, and that would ruin my sacred space. So I started to reflect on why else am I drawn to parks, and it's because of the cultural sites. So that led me moving to Michigan to pursue my master's in historic preservation, and I got to do everything from working for the Henry Ford estate, where my office was actually in Henry Ford's old bathroom. Goes to show how big it was. The River Raisin National Battlefield Park, which literally has nothing in existence from its period of significance from the early 1800s. So really realizing that I love modernism. And this is one of my favorite modern buildings. This is the ASM International Headquarters just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. That geodesic dome is entirely steel, entirely open. It creates a really unique environment. So while I was in graduate school, you start to pick up on the trends of what's happening in preservation. And in historic preservation, they finally started to realize we can't just tell stories of the upper echelons of society, specifically white men. So they started to talk, how do we tell stories about women, of people of color, of the queer community? How do we expand the narrative? And also, how do we preserve trades? So I've enjoyed opportunities of doing traditional trades work, hosting workshops. I've taught middle schoolers how to relay brick sidewalks, but I regularly attend these preservation events and they're talking about traditional trades, but it's always buildings trades. It's always trades associated that are historically male. And there's never any talk about traditional females trades like sewing. This is my first sampler when I was about 6 or so years old. When my family lived in Honduras, my mom enrolled me into sewing lessons. I also would go on to do the cotillion when I grew up in the South, so I learned all the great attributes of how to be a lady. Clearly some stuck. So I started to think, preservation, no matter how many ways we're trying to tell expanded narratives that accurately reflect our full communities, if we keep trying to tell those stories the exact same way, we're never going to be able to actually expand the narrative. So with my love of sewing, which continued on, I've sewn everything from quilts to embroideries to obviously plushies, but even before the Tiny Activist Project, I was sewing, things like pies. So I started to think through how can we start to connect the dots. And it started out with projects like these little farmers market bags. After touring the Japanese internment camps in California and visiting the Dust Bowl and seeing all these historical anecdotes of resiliency, people creating dresses out of old flour sacks, people creating dressers out of old fruit crates. I started to think, okay, what type of resiliency do we need today, and how can we connect people through agricultural history? So maybe it's stuff like sewing farmers markets bags, connecting people to their local farmers markets. How do we connect all these dots? But most people know me because of the Tiny Activist Project. On the left is my prototype Tiny Jane Jacobs. How many of you are familiar with who Jane Jacobs is? All right, some of you are, and that's totally normal. Most people don't know who Jane Jacobs is. Jane Jacobs is essentially the modern pioneer of the preservation and urban planning movement. The historic preservation movement started in the late 1800s with Anne Pamela Cunningham founding the Mount Vernon Association to preserve George Washington's home, which was being threatened with demolition. And then by the mid-1900s, things needed to start to be looked at in a more holistic community approach. And that's where Jane Jacobs came in. She was a critic for Architectural Forum, and she was living in Greenwich Village in New York City at that time. And at this time, urban renewal was very popular, and Robert Moses, her arch nemesis, wanted to destroy the very iconic Washington Square Park, which we see in many movies. It's quite a landmark. So Jane helped organize her community to reflect the importance of what saving this historic site is and what not destroying all these businesses would mean. She even got arrested for it. So she was a real rebel rouser, and all of this thought and practice would lead into her writing The Death and Life of Great American Cities. So I made this little prototype doll, and I went down to Houston, which is a city known for not having any zoning or really any laws at all when it comes to their built environment. So I thought it'd be funny to be on social media showing what would Jane Jacobs think if she was around today. And a lot of people were like, oh, she's so cute. I'd love to have my own little tiny Jane Jacobs. And I was like, well, this took me a while, and I didn't make a pattern. I was just kind of sewing how I felt. So I partnered with my friend since before birth, Shannon May, who's a wonderful illustrator based out of San Francisco. She currently works for Google. Don't hold that against her. But she's great and dynamic because while I can get by with drawing, I knew that if I was going to create a doll that I was going to produce in larger quantity, I wanted it to be my ideal Tiny Jane. So Tiny Jane is a way to help tell the history of historic preservation in the built environment and to inspire people to be a tiny activist for their community, to be that gateway. Because as I've attended these preservation conferences around the country, I've been to 8 already this year, I'm finding that people who even work in the field have no clue who she is. So, if we're not even talking about the icons and the history of our field, think of all those stories of those iconic people or very important people who worked on smaller scales. Those stories are getting lost somewhat rapidly, and I've been really pleased since launching this project. I get messages fairly regularly from people being like, oh my gosh, that reminds me of so-and-so person from my community. So as I've been thinking about how to expand the Tiny Activist Project, it's important to me to improve representation as best I can. So I've been working with the Latinos in Heritage Conservation. They're a wonderful, nationwide, very small nonprofit, but we actually started to crowdsource ideas of who the Latina activist could be. And the suggestions were amazing. It was everything from Sofia Rivera, who was part of the Stonewall riots, and she, as a Latina, a trans woman of color, would later on in her life go on working to preserve the intangible history from that night. Or Adina de Zavala, who in the late 1800s was working to save extant buildings from the Alamo. These are buildings that male historians at that time didn't see value in, but Adina understood that the larger context of that site would be invaluable moving on to the future. So we're still working to figure out who the right person would be, but that's one way I want to expand the story, and I'm so happy when you all wanted to celebrate I.M. Pei, because while we all know I.M. Pei for his architecture, I think we really forget the larger context into who he was as a person. When we talk immigration in America, most people think Ellis Island. We don't think Angel Island, which is where Pei came in, which is right in San Francisco Bay. And we don't even discuss that when Pei was able to immigrate here to America, it was actually illegal for anybody from Asia to come. And he was only allowed to immigrate because he had a student visa and he was able to show that he came from family with wealth. So he was able to overcome that immigration hurdle, but we're not discussing all those layers of immigration restrictions that we've had as a country for well over 100 years. And then later on, looking further into Pei's career, once he became an established professional, which for a man of Asian descent, that's still remarkable in America when statistically the field is still largely dominated by white men. Pei decided to use his expertise, his recognition to pay it forward. So Pei actually, after winning the Pritzker Prize in the 1980s, donated money and started funding academic careers for Chinese students to come to America to study architecture. So, these are really important parts of his career that help show holistically how he developed his design sensibilities, but also how he decided to push the architecture field forward in a really positive way. To give a further example of the lack of people of color in the architecture field, my bud Pascal Sablon, she is the 315th registered Black architect in the country. Only 315th. So even when we boil it down even further, there's even less women of color in the field. So this is at least one step to bridge recognition. And Tiny I.M. Pei is posing with the addition to the First Congregation Church in Jackson, Michigan. This is in addition to a church that was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So I obviously really like sewing. So I keep thinking, how are ways that we can teach history through tactile ways? Because I love a good walking tour, but people like to be tactile. People like to be multi-sensory, whether it's sound, smell, or otherwise. So I partnered with the company Spoonflower earlier this year. Spoonflower does custom printing of textiles, wallpaper, and gift wrap, and they do design challenges every single week. So every week they reach their international audience with a design challenge. So I partnered with them to encourage people to be inspired by desert modernism. And we partnered with Modern Phoenix Week specifically as our deadline. So you were supposed to be inspired by generations of architects, the fashion designers, the graphic artists. Think of like the Paolo Soleris, the Frank Lloyd Wrights, the Eichlers, all these really big icons. But we're looking at it from a way of creating a textile, because we all know women were integral to the mid-century modern textile movement. We have Florence Knoll, who revolutionized the way you could even view a swatch book. We have people like Ruth Adler-Cheney, who did incredible screen printing in her office, or the Steegers or the Adlers doing weavings. All of these women were really tied to the making of the modern home through textiles. And there's this really great video that you can find on YouTube that's all about block printing and women and how you can do it to customize your home textiles. Just really fun. So, we provided the design community all of these prompts to help them think through how they should interpret for contemporary. So we got over 500 submissions from around the world, and some people, went cutesy. It was really fun when people would start putting their design process online too. Some people went very architectural. So our winner was Cecilia Mock, who designed this more abstract piece. We really connected to it because we liked the blue, because of the lack of water in the desert, but its motifs and its textures just resonated with us. But, we didn't want to just have this design competition. We wanted to bring the design to life. So we had this wonderful event in a 1960s mall that has been vacant for a while, but it's slowly been being redeveloped. And the developer wanted to know, would this vacant storefront be a good potential makerspace? So we took over that storefront and turned it into a pop-up sewing studio for the evening, where all of these people of all ages, we had high schoolers to seniors, people of all backgrounds came, and they learned the history of women in the textile movement while learning to sew pillows, while reinvigorating this historic site. So we were able to have touch points on multiple levels to really resonate and bring this historic site to life. And it was really just endearing to see how excited people got by being empowered to sew something as simple as a pillow, which we know is only 3 sides because we did the cheater fold over. Made it real easy. And then afterwards, we enjoyed watching on the AstroTurf portion of the open air mall, watching Pillow Talk starring Doris Day. So, I just really think that as we're thinking through how we tell stories, what are the multiple angles that we fuse it into somebody's mind? Because we all learn differently. So how do we tell the stories, even through this one event, through a different facet? Because somebody may connect to this because of being in a vacant building. That's cool and different. Somebody may connect because they just want to learn how to make something, or maybe it's the history component. These are all these layers that we have to help connect the dots for people as preservationists. So a project that I'm currently working on, I love lustrons. Do any of you know what lustrons are? Yes. Great. So that's one of the perks of Columbus, Ohio. They manufactured them. So lustrons are a total boom-bust post-World War II structure. They are porcelain enamel panels, all those little squares that you see, that's each an individual panel. The interior of the home's entirely metal as well, so you can't hang things with a nail. It has to be with a special hook. It was supposed to be the future of housing. Unfortunately, from the business's creation in the 1946 or so, it closed down within 3 years. So it was a total failure. They couldn't figure out how to mass produce them. But I'm lucky enough to live in a neighborhood that has 4 of them. So as I'm riding my bike around all the time, I keep staring at these oddities, and I know that people purchase them and they tear them down regularly, because if you want one, you can find them dismantled online for very cheap. But I also know other people will just severely modify them. Like this one on the interior, it looks like any generic house on the inside now with carpet, drywall. At least they kept the exterior. So I've started doodling these buildings that I see in my neighborhood, and I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to tell a story of a lustron. Maybe it's through screen printing with my hanky, And, I'm starting to think about all the different ways, and based on the response that people have had to the tiny activist dolls, I'm even considering how do I make little three-dimensional buildings maybe better. So again, referencing Pascal, my architecture friend, she's thinking about how to build large-scale fabrics. So we all built pillow forts when we were little, but maybe we can create pillow forts out of fabric that have building materials on them, and make it a little bit more architectural to it. So she's thinking large scale, I'm thinking a bit smaller, but no matter what, we're trying to find different ways to tell stories of buildings, empower people to create them themselves. And it's really important to just keep trying different mediums. I took screen printing in college and I basically forgot everything. So it was really nice to be able to take a little workshop and have this be a way for me to have the wheels turning, because I really love printmaking. And that's what we're going to be doing with middle schoolers tomorrow. They're going to be doing some block printing like you see in the center. That's the Desert Hills neon sign that's on Route 66 in Oklahoma. But I've been facilitating and partnering with letterpress workshops, because again, a traditional trade that people have slowly been letting vanish. And we've been doing advocacy workshops. We've been having people create posters and postcards that are ways for them to be advocates for their sense of place. So we've created little posters that say I'm available to put in vacant stores. We've created postcards where I've then taught people how to properly write to a legislator, what kind of terminology do you use and whatnot. So there's really just lots of different ways that you can empower people to be the designer and to use a traditional trade or just learn a whole new skill. And if you've never done letterpress, it's really rewarding and very easy. And again, it has that tactile texture with the dip. This is a spoiler for my holiday gifts this year's. How many of you have a photo album at home that you never look at? All of us. Okay, how many of you go and visit a relative and you get really envious of the photos they have in their album that you don't have in yours? It's enraging. This adorable photo of my grandpa on a horse. I only have a digital copy of that, but how often am I digging through my photo folder on my computer and stumbling on that? So I thought it'd be really fun to find different ways to be able to remember regularly. And for me, one of the highlights of celebrating the holidays is pulling out the ornaments and having that spark memories. So I thought this could also be tied to archival images or family heirloom images. So I've been sewing and making all these, clearly I'm editing out the background a bit. They're all about 3 to 4 inches tall, but this way I can connect a bit more to my personal history. And I'm working with an organization in Toledo right now to do a workshop that's around lost landmarks of the city. So we'll be, doing holiday workshop, thematic, but a nice way to remember Toledo's lost history and have regular reminders of what's been lost to inspire us to be advocates to save the built future moving on. And like I said, I really like collaboration because I work from home and by myself, so I don't get to interact with people very often. But I've been doing this collaborative coloring book all year. My favorite drawing is this bottom left. It's Madeline, who's 9. She drew that Greek Revival Masonic Lodge. To the right is Heinen's in Cleveland. It's an old bank turned grocery store. So all of these drawings that people are submitting, and I'm also facilitating workshops around the state, the one thing that they have all in common is that they're all historic tax credit projects. So I'd say a normal person doesn't really know what a historic tax credit is. And if they did, I don't know why they would. There's no point. So historic tax credits across the entire country have been really integral to breathing new life into these buildings. But people, normal people who should be helping us advocate for them when they get threatened have no clue who they are, what they are. So I thought it'd be fun to do a coloring book, and it's actually going to have a guided tour associated with it so that you could travel around Ohio and visit these historic tax credit sites and better connect. I highly recommend going to Mitchell's Ice Cream in Ohio City. It is an old movie theater turned ice cream factory. And it's all thanks to historic tax credits. So, I just look for unconventional entry points to help educate people about the tools that exist. Because the one thing that I regularly hear is historic preservation's scary, it's overwhelming, it's academic. Oh, I'm not a preservationist because I don't have a degree. And no, anybody who believes in going and having ice cream just a block from here, that's a preservationist because they're going for that specific experience, that sense of place, whether they are realizing why they're choosing that over Applebee's or not. And we can find amazing examples from all over the country of people starting to think through a bit more art storytelling, because historically, textiles have been interwoven with storytelling since the advent of time, whether it's quilts or the beading in a traditional Native American garment, all of it tells stories. And I've really connected with this project by Oleg, and she has been collecting swatches, small swatches from anybody who crafts can submit and contribute to her larger scale crochet murals. And that's a really great way to, again, empower people to be a part of the larger project by just giving them a little piece of the pie, essentially. And we have Sojourner Truth on the left, we have Susan B. Anthony on the bottom right, Nina Simone in the top right, just these incredible women whose stories need to be recognized, they need to be told. Because if we look around, if we travel, I think we can all agree most of the monuments are dedicated to men. I mean, men who, in general, did great accomplishments, but where is our female representation? So this is a nice way to get the conversation started and going and collaborate and build that group of preservationists and make it bigger than what exists. Another project that I've really enjoyed watching evolve over the past few years, it's been led by a wonderful curator in Rochester, Hinda Mandel. And she is based in Rochester, New York, and she was very upset when she realized that Frederick Douglass's former home is now a parking lot. So how do you even comprehend telling a story when the physical aspects of it have been completely destroyed? When I did my work for the River Raisin National Battlefield Park, I proposed they build ghost structures, simple steel structures, and then focus on the gardening to breathe life into what it would have been like to be a French immigrant. But Hinda has taken the more crafty approach. She started out, I don't have a photograph, I'm sorry, but she started out by doing an embroidery of a traditional historic marker, and she hung it up. And then later on, somebody installed a marker. So every year, Hinda is finding new ways to try and tell the Frederick Douglass story. This most recent exhibit, I believe it's still up actually, Crafting Democracy, she solicited 9x9 squares where you could knit, you could crochet, you could embroider, just anything that you thought would help contribute to telling the story or breathing some vibrancy into a desolate lot. I was really happy. I got to contribute the embroidery in the bottom right that says tell the full history, because I really wanted something bold and text. But you see other people did peace signs. Somebody on the left, they did a little embroidery of what the house looked like. Everybody got to tell the story in a little different, and then collaborate for a larger. So Hinda's efforts doing these temporary textile installations have actually evolved into working with the parking lot owner to determine what could be permanent. So she's working with an artist, and they are coming up with some wild ideas where maybe they'll recreate a portion of that front porch. And then once you step over the threshold, noise starts coming where, it tells maybe a story or reads a letter that he wrote, or like maybe it's something else. They're just really in the staging process. But I think a great way to figure out how to tell stories is being willing to try things that aren't going to last for forever, just to see how they resonate and connect with people. You don't necessarily have to invest in a $3,000 bronze statue or whatever it is. You can just encourage people to find their voice and tell the stories. And if you really like to learn the history of craft and how it's been used as storytelling, but actually as activism, I highly recommend this book, which is going to be coming out this October, edited by Hinda. I got to read an advanced copy, and the thoughtfulness behind the entire narrative from learning in the Revolutionary War. When we all learn Revolutionary War, we basically learn men went to fight, right? We can all agree. But what did the women do in this time period? Women, to help break away from the British economy, they started focusing more on making more of their own clothes, making more of their own textiles, and that way America was not relying on outside economies. They could be self-sustained. So it really finds interesting ways to weave the past, weave that fabric and bring it to life for us. So I highly recommend this. It's a collection of essays, and to me, this is the future of preservation, trying new things, being willing to fall flat on your face. One story of me biffing it. I was really proud. I was working for the German Village Historic District at that time. It's been a historic district since the 1960s, so preservation has been at the forefront of that community's history. But they forgot that they should reevaluate what that historic narrative is. So their history and storytelling basically stopped at 1900 or so. So I thought it was really important to tell the queer history of the neighborhood because this was Columbus's first neighborhood. So how do we start to collect these stories and preserve them before they're too late? So I collected oral histories. I started doing these wonderful groups where we would have elders from the LGBTQ community with younger individuals. And that way you created a dialogue for a really dynamic back and forth to learn about personal experiences. And then I started to create a tour, and I did these test groups. And then I finally fully launched it to public, and nobody signed up. It went like 6, 7, 8 months. Nobody signed up for my beautiful tour. So, I had to go back to the drawing board and figure out, how am I marketing it? Is this the way I should best market something to connect with a large enough audience? Because it was a bit more of a focused tour, but it was a really valuable story. And then I've collected all these oral histories. How do I take these oral histories from being hour-long videos into digestible information? So I started modifying them into 30-second snippets that could be used on social media. And then once I started identifying these snippets for the really important stories, then it developed into a 10-minute mini documentary that I helped produce. So, this was a way to still find creative ways to tell the stories of the past in new ways. It's not an instant failure if people don't connect to the larger narrative right up front. It just means you're maybe not telling it right, and maybe you should try a creative strategy. So I'm happy to take any questions, but I definitely will plug again that I'd really like sewing with you on Saturday.
So a round of applause. And we can now open to any questions or comments. This is an informal discussion, so we don't have to get too serious. However, if there is a deep question about conservation and
tax credits, I can talk all of the. If you want to know about designations and tax credits, I will happily talk to you about them, and try not to bore you.
Give us like a 3-minute intro to that.
So every state historic tax credits vary. Unfortunately, in Indiana, you do not have a statewide historic tax credit, but you have a lovely grant program. But then we have the federal historic tax credit program, which can get you up to 25% of your qualifying project cost, which is huge, if you're fixing an old building. So, that'll help you fix your windows or replace a roof or what have you. In many other states, in Ohio, there is the state tax credit as well, where if it's an income producing property, you can get up to 20%. So then you end up total 45% of your project costs are covered. In other states like New York or Georgia, they also have tax credits for residential projects. So anybody can apply for them to help fix up their home. I'm very jealous of those people. So these tax credits are all based, each state varies a little bit differently, but for the federal tax credits, your property has to be on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, being on the National Register of Historic Places shows that you either have a building that's exemplary for something that happened there, people that lived there, people who designed it, or maybe there is some intangible cultural significance that is a little bit more loosey-goosey, like a cultural landscape, for example. A cultural landscape would be every year this tribe went to this hill and they did their solstice celebrations, but they didn't live there. So, it's a little bit more loosey-goosey and tangible. So to be on the National Register, it's a hurdle because it's a high level of designation, but that's what you need to do to qualify for historic tax credits. And when you're going through the historic tax credits, your reviewers essentially are having you do everything the quote-unquote right way. So that means you are meeting the National Park Service Secretary of the Interior standards. You're not replacing wood windows with vinyl windows. You are doing things to uphold the historic integrity of a structure. And, these are really great. Unfortunately, in majority of states, these are largely used by developers. But I have started to see more of a movement of people learning how to do this process on their own. And it's been really incredible. There's this one town in Ohio, Marion, Ohio, where this woman, she's mid-late 30s, and her mom, they learned how to do historic designations on their own, and then they learned how to do historic tax credits on their own because they were like, we don't have the cash to pay somebody, but we need to know these buildings need to be fixed. So we are going to learn as we go and work with the State Historic Preservation Office to make it happen. For local designations, though, so a local designation means that your municipality has recognized that, again, you met one of those criterias, and typically there's some level of design review. So, in Indianapolis, they have plenty of historic districts and individual buildings, but in many states, if you just have a local historic designation, then you can still qualify for those state historic tax credits. For historic designations, there's local, which is the quote-unquote lowest level, but it's actually one of the best levels because local designation actually has teeth to help protect a building from being demolished. The National Register of Historic Places designation sounds wonderful, but it doesn't mean diddly. You can kick the building, you can tear it down, you can do whatever you want to it. It doesn't really matter. It's just an honorific that is a gateway to getting those financial incentives. Above the National Register of Historic Places is a National Historic Landmark, and that is the highest honor in America for a building. Now, being a National Historic Landmark does have some oversight by the National Park Service, which is the mothership for preservation. And if you don't obey the mother, then you can risk some fallout. The Downtown Historic District in Savannah, Georgia, actually is currently under review, and it may potentially be de-designated because they've allowed too much contemporary development, which the National Park Service does not find to be compatible with the historic architecture. If we're going even bigger, though, globally, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, that is the highest ultimate honor in history designation. There aren't a ton of those sites in the Midwest. Right now, there are a number of Native American mounds in Ohio that are up for review. Most recently, a number, not all of his buildings, but a number of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings were added to the UNESCO World Heritage listings. And then another thing that isn't a designation, but it's added teeth that you can get for your building is a preservation easement. So let's say I've spent all this time, money, and effort preserving my lovely historic home. I don't want somebody to be able to come and buy it and then tear it down in 50 or 100 years even. So I put an easement on my property and somebody holds it. Indiana Landmarks holds them, for example, here. And then they monitor the building in perpetuity with all future owners to ensure that that building does not get destroyed in the manner to which you agreed. And it could be interior and exterior. It can be really as intense as you want to make it as a property owner. And then because of your loss of development rights on your property, then you can actually get some tax incentives from it as well. So there's a lot of different nerdy preservation stuff. But like this is why, I want the, why I'm like, okay, how do I get people to even want to learn about tax credits? Okay, I'll show them buildings that have been fixed by it, and then maybe they'll want to maybe look a little further. But man, as somebody who works in the field, those bureaucratic documents put me to sleep. So I don't even understand how a normal person jumps through those hoops. So I just really want to find bite-sized ways to educate people, because I hear preposterous things. I've heard from people that they believe the National Register requires them to have their home open once a day in the year, like every year. People believe that that protects their property, and then they sell the property, and then the property gets torn down. They're like, well, I have this expensive designation. What does it mean? So how do we help make preservation a little less academic and fussy? Because at the end of the day, we're saving these buildings not just because Pei designed it. We're saving these buildings because there's intrinsic community value to them, that they help create our sense of place, that they tell specific stories, that they're places that people want to interact with and engage with. We're not saving things just for a solitary purpose.
Any other questions?
So you mentioned that developers are often the savviest about using these different designations to get tax credits. Is there sort of a move towards doing adaptive reuse, combining that with historic tax credits?
Yes.
Because, there's white elephant buildings. People want to preserve them, but they don't know how they're going to make it financially viable. So is there a way to do that with adaptive reuse?
Yeah, you can use the tax credits for adaptive reuse. The Heinen's bank building on the right turned into a grocery store, the first downtown grocery store in Cleveland. I've seen, again, an ice cream shop and an old movie theater. I've seen all types of out-of-the-box thinking. I think it's a matter of helping people see what the vision is, which is why I really enjoyed the collaboration for the vacant space in Phoenix. Louis Sullivan, he designed beautiful banks. He was, and among other buildings, but he was Frank Lloyd Wright's mentor. You have some jewel box banks up in the northern part of your state. So there's this beautiful Sullivan Bank that had been sitting vacant for I don't even know how long in Ohio, in Newark, Ohio. And I worked with the nonprofit that had acquired it to do design charrettes, where we would have different demographics come in and talk about what would get you to come back to this building. We just showed you a really cool decaying building tour, but what would get you to come back when life has been breathed into it? And we got these really great ideas, everything from, have different uses for different floors. It doesn't have to all be one thing. So, that starts to get the cogs turning. One group wanted a tiny indie theater in the basement where the locker rooms were. So I appreciate that because, it's a dark, dim space. Okay, we got to think of dark, dim uses. But after all of these focus groups, what kept connecting, and it was shocking because with all the different demographics, we kept hearing people, they really wanted some type of visitor center, which you guys have a lovely visitor center, but I think we can all agree not all visitor centers are created equally. But people wanted to be able to come to this bank and have it be a public use, at least the first ground level. And then they also they decided to have that be the ground level, which makes sense because Newark at this time, and again, they're currently up for review to be part of an entire trail of Native American mounds designated UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there's been tourism impact studies to show how many more people that'll bring in. So, okay, the first floor visitor center, and that allows this to be a public space so everybody can come in. And then the upper levels will be offices for income generating. And the last I heard, they're still trying to decide what to do with the sad little basement. But that's because for historic tax credits, there are some issues with adding elevators sometimes. Because we know we want our buildings to be accessible, but sometimes you have to get a bit more creative on how to create that accessibility for a historic structure. But, eventually they got awarded the historic tax credits, but, they started to reach out to the public for best uses. And that's a really nice situation where the developer was a nonprofit. But I coordinate these tours fairly regularly to decaying buildings. And I think sometimes building owners or developers just need to hear some ideas outside of offices. because we have enough offices. But you know, like, what else does your community need? What else is missing from the surrounding area? And you can adapt the buildings in wild ways that you could have never fathomed and get these types of funding. I'm not as familiar with your statewide grant program and what type of restrictions it is, but federally, you can stretch it a lot further than I ever expected you could, because we want new life in these old buildings at the end of the day.
So I'm not sure really even what my question is, but I'm just interested in your reaction to, you know, here you are in Columbus, Indiana, a community that is, you know, our entire identity is tied to our architectural heritage, yet, and most of our downtown is on the National Register of Historic Places, right? And we have 7 buildings designated National Historic Landmarks, but yet have no local protections. And I'm just interested in.
On the one hand, I love it in concept, believing that people will intrinsically do the right thing in perpetuity. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily believe it. I guess that just reflects poorly on me. So to me, the local review really does matter, especially in situations like this where we are looking at largely mid-century, but also lovely buildings from the late 1800s, early 1900s. These materials are changing and evolving in a way that having a design review board can help have standards to ensure that it not only aesthetically looks right, but also the materials that are needed for replacement are the right types of materials. Something that many design review boards do is they'll have test case scenarios where they'll test out a specific new contemporary building material on a little, lesser visible spot of a building, and that way you know if it actually is right for a full structure. Compared to if I own this building, I could go whole hog with it right now, and I may be shooting myself in 5 years when that degrades. So it helps create some standards and also an invaluable support system at the end of the day. Because from my attending these architectural review meetings, it really does elevate the standards of new construction in a way that's really positive. Because you never know, somebody might want to blow the top off of some of these buildings and build up. You never know, this is a desirable community. It might boom one day and require more density. You never know. So I know that local designations are really tough because I understand why people really value the private property rights, and I understand, you bought the building, you should be able to do more or less what you want with it, but you bought that building for a reason, and that reason is because you were captivated by the design or its history, so you should be able to be okay with going that next step of design review. And like I said, it really helps determine best materials, because most architects don't understand historic building materials the same way a preservationist does. And I attend enough of these conferences that, I went to one where they had an entire session on glass blocks. My little mind went, pfft. I couldn't comprehend it, but speaking with the professional who has that expertise, I now know, okay, here's the right materials to replace it with the right type of scaling, and also something that's going to last in longevity. Because we don't talk about it enough in preservation, in my mind, is sustainability is inherently tied to preservation. There's the saying, the greenest building is the one already standing. But it's also, our replacement materials, we also should be looking things that have longevity. And if we're looking at contemporary pine for windows, those are basically trash. No offense to them. I just got some fiberglass windows for my house because the originals were all gone, and let's fingers cross those age well. They're supposed to do a lot better than vinyl. So I'm science experimenting on my house so that you don't have to.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Yes. Do you have, I assume you have a lot of interest in the preservation of textiles, historical textiles from different Native American textiles, all types of things that have been done in past over the generations. You know, any particular thing that comes to mind?
I really like mid-century, so I'm so grateful to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I specifically, my interests are mid-century and then Native American. Show me a Victorian era house and I'm like, fine, those frills are nice, but I like clean lines, I like the color blocking, I like the juxtapositions, and I feel like those specific design sentiments really just bring it to life in a great way. So I was really lucky when I was doing my undergrad degree at Northern Arizona. I got to work in the collections department for the Museum of Northern Arizona. I got to build all new housing for all these beautiful textiles from the 1500s, 1600s, and just the weight, understanding the weight of a beaded piece worn in ceremonies, that's a real experience. And they must have been really buff.
Excellent. Okay, I have one last thing that we do need to talk about. Can you describe what you're doing with the Tiny Actives project when you're selling the Jane?
So a portion of every single doll sold, and now that I'll have Tiny IM, he'll help build the scholarship fund. So I offer tiny scholarships for people with big dreams to attend the National Trust for Historic Preservation Conference. Over the past almost 3 years, I've given over 10 scholarships to help people attend the conference. Because again, yes, I like making my tiny Janes and sewing them's really calming and nice, but what would Jane want to do? What do people want to do? We need to help support the next generation of people in cultural institutions, because people are graduating with a large amount of debt and going into cultural institution jobs, which typically do not pay very well, and that's actually tied to them being historically women's labor jobs, and women's labor, whether it's teaching, museums, libraries, preservation, statistically have a lower pay rate. So this is my way to support emerging and next professionals, because while they're tiny scholarships, that at least covers a chunk of their registration. If they're a student, it covers the entire registration. So I've really enjoyed doing that, and I was thinking with Tiny IM, I'll now make it so that people can select which they prefer of 2 conferences. So maybe it's going to be you could choose between DocoMomo or the National Trust Conference. I'm still noodling on it, but I have some time. He'll help me figure it out.
So Sarah, if people cannot attend the workshop, they can also reach out to you about purchasing an
already made or a fabric if you would like to sew outside of our designated sewing hours. I have them back at the hotel if you'd like to save $7 on shipping.
So they can stop by.
You can knock on the inn and be like, I came for a doll, and they'll be like, oh. No, so I'm around and I'm on social media, Sarah Marsom, or I have my card if you'd like my phone number and we could figure out a collision. But I really hope you'll come and stitch with me on Saturday, because we're gonna be talking a lot about how women were behind the modernism in Columbus, and how, if you ask most people, it'd be really fun to do like a viral video where you just run around and ask, do you know who Cleo is? Do you know who Cleo is? And I'm sure most of them would be like, I have no clue. So let's talk about who Cleo is on this 50th anniversary, and all the other women who made the home, whether they were stitching a nice little seat cushion or something else.
Thank you.